Hello everyone, my name is Achille Yona and welcome back to my YouTube channel. And if you are new here, then just welcome. I'm so delighted for you to join us for today's topic. Go ahead and subscribe to my channel because you do not want to miss the content I have to share and discuss with you. I have information that your history teachers won't tell you or can't tell you. I am going to be discussing Asian slaves in colonial America and how Asian slaves became identified as American Indians. Disclaimer: this topic is touchy and feelings will probably be hurt, but however, the truth is the truth and no one can distort it or destroy it no matter what they do. This information has been available but hidden from us for obvious reasons. And oh, yeah, another disclaimer. More than likely, I will butcher some of these names as some of them are Spanish and I don't speak Spanish, or at least well. So I will try my best to pronounce these names and terms the best way I can. So without further ado, I'm gonna shut my trap and get on with the video. Slaves from Asia were traded in a smaller but nevertheless influential trade. Thousands of slaves from the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia traveled to Mexico on the Manila galleon ships during the late 16th and 17th centuries. Juan Nunez, a slave from Calicut, India, who belonged to Fray Juan de Zumarraga, the first bishop of New Spain, was one of the first Asians to be reported in Mexico. He was brought from Spain to work as the bishop's cook and was emancipated in Zumarraga's will on June 2nd, 1548. Regular immigration, on the other hand, did not begin until 1565 with the creation of the Manila Acapulco galleon, which lasted until 1815, which economically connected Asia, the Americas, and Europe together. In exchange for the New World silver, the Manila galleon, or Nayo de China or Nayo de Acapulco, transported porcelain, silk, ivory, spices, and a plethora of other exotic commodities from China to Mexico. It is estimated that up to one third of the silver mined in New Spain and Peru was exported to the Far East. The priceless Asian merchandise were transported back across the Pacific via the Philippines, colonized by Spain in the late 15th century, to Acapulco on Mexico's west coast. They then traveled across Mexico by land to Spain. Much of the porcelain and carved ivory, on the other hand, remained in the Americas and in many cases impacted artists working there. The impact of the galleon trade is most visible in Mexican ceramics. However, some of the patterned garments of the Guatemalan sculptures, whose face also showed the subtle influence of Asian ivory carvings, may have been inspired by Chinese silk designs. The realization that Christopher Columbus had fallen short of his goal of reaching China put a temporary halt to efforts to unite East and West. This changed after Ferdinand Magellan's relatively successful voyage to the Spice Islands via America, demonstrating that Europeans could sail westward rather than around Africa to reach Asia's riches. After seeing the Pacific Ocean, conquistador Hernan Cortez wrote to King Charles V proposing to supply ships on Mexico's western coast to continue his explorations. His efforts, like an ill-fated expedition in 1541, were in vain. Despite these failures, the allure persisted, so Philip II backed another attempt, this time led by Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, who succeeded in establishing a Spanish colony in the Philippines in 1565. On this voyage, Legazpi's interpreter was a Bengali named Geronimo Pacheco, who was originally from the Eastern Islands. This colonial classification of Asians should not be confused with Chino, a casta term used in New Spain to describe people of mixed ancestry, primarily African and American Indian. He arrived in Mexico by the way of Spain and was one of the first Chinos to live there. Notably, the thousands of other Asians who were sent to Mexico in the aftermath of this expedition had a less circuitous journey, as Legaspi's pilot discovered a return route across the Pacific in 1565. Previous voyages had circumnavigated the globe. The Manila Galleon, which connected the economies of Asia and Spanish America for the next 250 years, began with this first voyage from the Philippines to Mexico. The name Manila Galleon refers to the trade route that ran between the ports of Manila and Acapulco, as well as the ships that plied the Pacific yearly. The Royal Treasury funded the galleon infrastructure to support the outlying colony, whose economy was based on exporting Chinese goods to the New World in exchange for silver. The crown intended to regulate the trade, but the government enforcement was lax at the local level, resulting in widespread contraband. The Manila Galleon was supposed to be two ships, each weighing 300 tons, carrying merchandise worth 250,000 pesos on the way to Mexico and 500,000 silver pesos or bullion on the way back, according to the permiso, government permission. Westward ships on average weighed 1,000 tons and returned with 2 million silver pesos. On both sides of the ocean, ship registries were routinely falsified in order for the Manila galleon to embark with as much cargo as possible. The smuggled cargo included slaves from the Philippines. From the end of the 16th to the beginning of the 17th century, the Manila galleon served as a transport vessel for the Trans-Pacific slave trade. The slave trade on the galleons was based on a large and diverse slave market in Manila, where Mexico bound merchants bought their slaves. Many of the slaves were foreigners who had been brought to the Philippines by Portuguese traders from as far as India. Others were indigenous to islands in the Philippines under direct Spanish control, as well as nearby islands populated mostly by Muslims who opposed colonization. We can estimate that the majority of slaves came from present day India is 39%, specifically the Malabar Coast and Bengal, based on demographic data for 190 people. Slaves from the present day countries of Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, and a few from China were supplied in smaller numbers by the Portuguese. The Philippines was the other major region of origin, with Manila accounting for the majority of slaves. However, as with the Atlantic slave trade, sale deeds frequently listed the embarkation point rather than the slave's birthplace, so we can't be certain of their provenance. Significantly, after the Portuguese went to war with Spain and were thus barred from disembarking in Manila in the 1640s, the number of foreign slaves shipped decreased, while the export of indigenous slaves increased. While the Portuguese influx of foreign slaves dwindled, the Manila galleon traders were increasingly forced to rely on local supply. Due to the Philippines' native maritime culture, Filipinos were also pressed into service as sailors. When Mexico revolted against Spain in 1565, hundreds of Filipino mariners jumped ship in Mexico to flee the brutality of their Spanish masters, and some migrated to East Louisiana. As early as 1765, Filipino settlements were established in Louisiana. The early Filipinos were all men who intermarried with local women, including Indian women. By 1619, the Manila Galleon crews were almost entirely made up of Filipino native sailors. During the voyages, many of them died as a result of harsh treatment and hazardous conditions. In addition, many of the galleons were old, overloaded, and in need of repair. A law passed in 1608 that limited Filipino sailors geared to ropa necesaria, which consisted of a single pair of breeches, resulting in a large number of Filipino sailors dying from exposure. Because of these circumstances, King Philip III signed a law in 1620 requiring merchants to provide proper clothing to native crew members. Many Filipino sailors deserted as soon as they arrived in Acapulco during this time. Only 5 Filipino crew members remained for the return voyage, according to Sebastian de Paida, captain of the galleon Espiritu Santo, who complained to the king in 1619. The sailors that had deserted, these sailors settled in Mexico and married Mexicans, even if some had previously married in the Philippines, especially since their skills in the production of tuba, coconut wine, were in high demand by wine merchants in Colima. Catarina de Juan, also known as Mira, an Indian girl captured by the Portuguese and sold in slavery in Manila, she arrived in New Spain and quickly gained a reputation for her religious piety, eventually becoming known as the China Plobana. Before disappearing in the second half of the 19th century, the Chana Plobana, or Semisan, was considered the traditional style of dress for women in Mexico, despite the fact that it only existed in a few urban zones in the country's middle and southeast. Plobanas are Ploba women. Catarina de Juan is credited with designing the Chana Plobana dress, though it undoubtedly incorporates elements from the many cultures that coexisted in New Spain during the 3 centuries of Spanish rule. The number of Asian slaves during the colonial era is estimated to be between 40,000 and 120,000. Mexico received approximately half a million Europeans and 250,000 Africans during the colonial era. Over generations, the Asian population was absorbed into the general mestizo population, much like a large portion of Mexico's black population had been. The assimilation of Asians into the indigenous population helped to facilitate miscegenation. Asian slaves could claim they were wrongfully enslaved if they were recognized as a part of indigenous peoples who were legally protected from chattel slavery. Asians did, however, carry some rights that most indigenous peoples did not, such as the ability to carry a sword, dagger, or ride a horse in some cases. In the 1654 case of Marcos de Villanueva, arguing that his people helped quell a Sangli rebellion in Manila, there are examples of chinos proving their standing to authorities in order to carry arms. Others argued that when transporting goods through remote areas, carrying arms was a requirement. The samurai who remained in Mexico as envoys from Japan were the most privileged Asians. During the 19th century, many Chinese and Filipinos immigrated to the United States to work on plantations and railroads. According to modern descendants, Hirilio Hongo, a Chinese farm worker who arrived in Louisiana via Cuba in 1867, married Azeli Phillip, an Indian woman. Other Filipino and Chinese workers who stayed in the United States were adopted by Indian tribes and married indigenous women. Their descendants are classified as Indians. Juan Esteban Rodriguez, a population genetics graduate student at Mexico's National Laboratory of Genomics for Biodiversity, had intended to research a recent thread in the global tapestry, Mexican ancestry. Rodriguez grew up near the Mexican American border and wanted to see if he could pinpoint the genetic contribution of Chinese immigrants to the modern Mexican population. But when he looked for genetic variants more common in Asian populations in a database of 500 Mexican genomes assembled for biomedical research, he discovered something unexpected. Although some people in northern Mexico had significant Asian ancestry, they were far from alone. Rodriguez discovered that up to 10% of the people in Guerrero, a Pacific coastal state nearly 2,000 kilometers south of the US border, had Asian ancestry, which was significantly higher than most Mexicans. He discovered that their genomes were most closely related to populations from the Philippines and Indonesia when he compared them to those of people in Asia today. The Trans Pacific slave trade was a phenomenon that occurred in the late 16th and early 17th centuries and was dependent on a number of factors. To begin, the Spanish Empire had to expand as far as Asia in order for slave traders to have a base from which to procure slaves and organize their sales abroad. Foremost, there needed to be a means of transport, which was provided by the manila galleon infrastructure. Consequently, the international political environment had to allow Portuguese traders with access to distant regions to deliver slaves for this transoceanic market. Furthermore, the local colonial government in the Philippines had to make it easier for foreign and indigenous slaves to be exported, which included ignoring the enslavement of Spanish vassals and ignoring contraband. Mexican officials had to be equally deceitful. Sadly, the crown had to allow the slave trade on some level, acknowledging that the colonies needed more labor and that such trade could generate significant profits. Do you think Asians being adopted and seen as indigenous affect how we view American Indian identity today? Why were there Asians being granted indigenous status with little or no indigenous ancestry so easily? Why aren't we being taught this in school? Comment below your thoughts. Be sure to purchase my book, Discovering Genealogy, to learn more on how to research your genealogy, Indigenous American ancestry, and of course, to learn more about Asian slaves in the Americas. My name is Achille Yona, and thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button to get notified when I upload a new video. It's been real, and until the next time,